I'm Steve Matheson. I'm from Eastern Passage, Nova Scotia. I have a collection of postcards that I got when I was a teenager from my grandmother. She corresponded with a number of people from around the world, many of whom were on active service during World War I. You know, this has been a nice gem hidden in my closet collecting dust, so I think it's time that we dust them off, see what they're all about.
Steve Matheson's grandmother collected these postcards and photographs as a teenager growing up in Halifax during the First World War. Despite the horrors happening in the distant trenches of Europe, it was an exciting time in Halifax, especially for a young woman coming of age. The war fueled an economic boom for the city, jobs were plentiful, and women joined the workforce like never before. Halifax Harbour was busy with ships transporting men and supplies to feed the war effort. But Halifax's wartime heyday came to a sudden apocalyptic end when the Mont Blanc, laden with munitions, collided with the Emo at mid-harbour. The Halifax Explosion was the deadliest disaster in Canadian history, killing nearly 2,000 people. Thousands more were blinded, maimed, or left homeless. The explosion scarred Halifax in a way the war had not.
We're here at the Army Museum with Steve Matheson, who has brought in a series of postcards that belong to his grandmother. Some of these postcards date before the First World War, and many of them are from the era of the war. You've brought these in, and I was wondering what you could tell us about them.
Well, I was given these cards when she was quite elderly and I was a teenager at the time. I was more interested in the picture sides of them at the time, but as I get more interested in history, what's on the back of them is actually by far more interest. So my grandmother was a teenager during the 1910s. She would do kind of like a pen pal type thing, send cards off to people with pictures of Halifax on it in hopes of exchanging pictures of where they are from. And they would exchange them back and forth. Some, like this gentleman, ended up serving once war broke out, and the story changes from, vistas from this fellow's hometown to areas where he ended up serving. He talks about his wound. He had some shrapnel in his head. He actually had to get teeth removed before he went back to the front. And he talks about it in these writings very nonchalantly, saying things like, "Don't bother writing me back. I'm going back to the front and I probably won't be able to keep them."
You got to remember, all of these cards would have been read by a military censor to make sure that there's nothing compromising in those things. That could be quite innocently said. Just the fact that he said, "I'm going back to the front."
I'm amazed that actually got left back
through.
in.
Yeah.
In this card here, for example, if you flip that over, you can see that there's reference to the Censorship Bureau. So you can see there's a censor stamp.
He's scrubbed that out. Yeah.
What they scrubbed out, and not very well, because you can actually see through it, was the date.
Yeah.
Is they didn't want anybody able to track troop movements.
That's right.
Is something as simple as a date on a letter was considered sensitive information and was censored.
Yeah. 100 years ago, the only form of communication you had were letters, and again, these postcards. And what's interesting too is that in the First and again in the Second World War, postcards with images and drawings and things like that can also be used for military intelligence services as well, to gain information about areas that they're going to. Steve, you've also brought in these views that your grandmother collected, photographs that were taken in the wake of the Halifax Explosion.
So my grandmother was a survivor of the Halifax Explosion. She was apparently at work in an office building. We hear about all the windows breaking in Halifax. Well, apparently this building had like a glass skylights, something of this nature. She got a phone call, most likely from somebody telling her about the fires. So when she got the phone call was, not in her pocket, not on her desk. There was one room off to the side that had the telephone in it. So she had to get up and go off to the side room to answer the phone. That's when the glass from the ceiling came in. And her leaving that room because not having a phone on her desk may very well have saved her life, or at least saved her from being maimed. Either her or maybe my grandfather would have purchased these just as mementos, but they certainly show a lot of the destruction in the aftermath.
Now this photograph here is a great way to tie in the aspect or the role of the Halifax garrison the morning and in the days that will follow the disaster of the Halifax explosion. The Halifax garrison had been here to protect the city since 1749 and its citizens, and on the morning of December 6, 1917, the troops of the Canadian garrison, the men and women of the Canadian Armed Services, they don't miss a beat. By sundown on December 6, 1917, those people that have made their way from the North End down onto the Commons, by sundown, everybody in Halifax has a place to get in out of the cold. The city's garrison will play a paramount role in the relief, rescue, and recovery of the Halifax explosion. So the garrison troops give up their barrack areas for the civilians. So they do an enormous amount. First day, distribution of food. First people to kind of like pull people out of burning buildings or get them out of the ruins of the explosion. Sadly, the next day, a lot of that will continue, but will be looked at as sort of like body recovery by that time. The best and worst of humanity all rolled into one, the Halifax explosion. Well, Steve, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the Army Museum for coming in today and sharing these items of family history. And at this point in the program, we often ask people if they'd like to donate or loan anything to the Army Museum in this regard that they brought in. But this is a close personal family collection and, again, a personal interest of yours. So I wouldn't dream of trying to part you with your grandma's postcards. But thanks again for coming in and sharing this with us.
Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity to share. I appreciate it.